3, 2. Welcome to the Company of Dads podcast, where we explore the sweet, silly, strange, and sublime aspects of being a lead dad in a world where men who are the go-to parent aren't always accepted at work, among their friends, or in the community for what they're doing. I'm your host, Paul Sullivan. Our podcast is just one of the many things we produce each week at the Company of Dads. We have various features, including the Lead Dad of the Week. We have our community, both online and also with some in-person events. We have a new resource library for all fathers. The one-stop shop for all of this is our newsletter, The Dad. So sign up at thecompanyofdads.com/thedad. Today, my guest is Mita Mallick, an inclusion advocate and LinkedIn top voice. She's the head of diversity, equity, and inclusion at Carta, a tech company that helps more people own parts of other companies. We're here to talk about her book, Reimagine Inclusion, Debunking 13 Myths to Transform Your Workplace. Full and embarrassing disclosure, years ago, I interviewed Mita when I was at the New York Times, and I didn't quote her in the story. As a lead dad, it was, in retrospect, my Homer Simpson moment. Dope. But Mita, to her immense credit, doesn't bring this up and is here today to talk. So Mita Mallick, welcome to the Company of Dads podcast.
Thank you, Paul, for having me. I appreciate you.
Before I had kids, I played poker with a group of journalists, both men and women, in New York. And I remember this conversation with one of them. Was a New York Times editor named Brent Bowers. And he's about to publish a book with the subtitle, 8 Patterns of Highly Effective Entrepreneurs. And he and I debated whether even or odd numbers were better for this. You went with 13, the unluckiest number of all, but very catchy to detail the myths. What happened with there? I mean, surely you could have had 20 or 50 myths, but talk about the significance of 13 and these 13 myths. That
13 is my lucky number. June 13th is my birthday. So I
go with 13.
Yes, it's my lucky number. And so we won't overthink it. But I thought my first book, I've been waiting a long time to publish it. I'm going with 13.
All right. That's a good way to think about it. My lucky number is 5. There are 5 people in my family.
5's a good number too.
All right. You know, you pull no punches here with challenging and some might say, cringeworthy chapter titles like, I'm all for diverse talent as long as they're good. Or why are you asking for a raise? You and your husband make good money. Or we need more people of color in leadership. Let's launch a mentorship program. These resonate as true. We've had many guests on who've talked about, these microaggressions, these moments where people say things that just, becomes the head exploding emoji. How do we change the workplace so that the sequel to this book has 13, completely banal chapter titles like my value was appreciated and I received the appropriate raise?
Well, thank you for reading the book. I know you had an advanced copy and I know time is a precious commodity. I wrote the myths in the way I did because they're the stories we hold on to. It's like the bedtime stories we tell our children at night, the stories that aren't true that we hold on to a workplace, and it holds us back from making meaningful progress. And how do we do that? We do that by interrupting our own bias, by challenging each other with kindness and respect when we hear bias show up in the workplace. And there's no destination, Paul, to be an inclusive leader. It's a constant journey. Yeah. And so part of that journey and leadership, I always say, it's not a right, it's a privilege. You have to continue to want to learn and want to do better. And so if you continue to strive to do that, we will end up in a better place tomorrow than we are right now in our workplaces.
Yeah. I'd say that, before I left the Times, my career in journalism, I was very fortunate in that I had more, good managers and good mentors than I had, bad managers, but there's still, plenty of bad ones out there. And, I also felt like, when I was on the receiving end, if somebody told me something like, hey, you said something, it's not appropriate, I got it. And I I changed, but not everyone does that. And so,
yes.
When you think people listening to this and they think, okay, all right, this is great. She's got this senior job. She's helping make policy at this company, but how do I apply, some of the things that she's putting out in this book to me? Because sometimes I'm going to go to a manager and it's like, hey, you know what you said was inappropriate, and let me explain to you why. Can we change your behavior? The person does, and of course, sometimes they don't. And so, what do you do when that person isn't as amenable to change, to getting rid of one of the 13 myths that he or she is part of?
I love that question. One of the things I have done often in my career and continue to do is not just speak up on behalf of myself, but others. And I'm tired. I'm tired,
Yeah.
Paul. So I want people listening to think about, stop being the bystander. When
Right.
you see something, say something, a little bit like the New York City subway. But when you see something, say something. And let's not forget, there is, as you're saying, power, privilege, politics in our workplace. So in my career, when I have been the most junior and something happened or I saw something, I didn't always speak up, nor did I feel comfortable because I knew there would be retaliation. But what if I found someone in the workplace who, like yourself, was more senior, let's say, at the level of the person who had done something inappropriate? What if I went and spoke to you about it?
Right.
What if I found other people who could help me navigate that? And here's the thing, Paul, when we look at the marketplace right now, the power, one might argue, is in the hands of the employer. It always swings back and forth, right? And so your employer brand and what your company stands for is ultimately what your employees say about you.
Right.
And so if you decide to keep Mita, who's a toxic leader in your organization, when she's had 5 women of color leave in 9 days, when it's a rotating door, right? Revolving door, recruiters just trying to keep putting people on my team.
Yeah.
People leaving, guess what? I'm the problem. It's me, as Taylor Swift would say in my daughter's favorite anti-hero song. Hi, it's me. I'm the problem. It's me. I am the problem. And so the question is, how much are you as the CEO going to do to protect me and actually put your own leadership brand at risk and your own reputation while I continue to cause hurt and harm to others? And I think that more and more employees are like, I want to know what you're really about, company A,
Right.
company X. And be like, I'm going to ask those tough questions once I get the offer because I want to make sure this is a healthy environment.
And it's such a good point because certain companies, certain industries pride themselves on, we're just going to get the work done. We're not going to care about it. And we talked about one of the other things. We had the lead dad of the week, and this fellow who's the lead dad of the week this week worked in advertising, Madison Avenue Classic, and he said to me, he's like, I was really fortunate to be laid off when my children were born. And I said, that doesn't sound very fortunate to me. And he said, no, because he was able to carve out a career in which he was able to pick and choose who he would work for. He was a freelance creative director, but was compensated well, and had the flexibility to be able to be an involved dad to support his wife in what she was doing career-wise, and he would never have been able to do that otherwise. And now he's in a position where he teaches at School of Visual Arts, SVA, in New York, and he talks about this in class about how to find the good people
right
to work for. But when you think, and we were at an event where I was listening to you a couple months ago, and you were giving advice to some of the younger people in the audience, and when they think they've landed that plum job, and there's that cognitive dissonance, like, this is where I want to be, this is the company I love, I really enjoy what I'm doing, but there is this toxic manager. Is there, do you think, at most companies or companies that you're working for or have seen, enough avenues for that person to get what he or she wants to continue moving up? Or is it sometimes, unfortunately, we still have to just leave and go to a company or work for somebody who more accurately mirrors our own values?
That's a great question. I've been in times in my career where I was pretty senior and worked for someone pretty toxic, and there was just no way but out.
Right.
I do think also when you work in very large organizations like a Fortune 10, Fortune 50, Fortune 100, there's a lot of places to move.
Right.
And so if your manager is toxic, and here's the thing, you're not always going to get along with your boss. I've had great bosses and I've had some not so great bosses. And so the number one mistake I made in my career, and I see so many people make, is you tie your fortunes to that one boss, right? And you can't. You have to really be thinking about, who else can I get to invest in my career with me?
Yeah.
Who else can I be showing the value of my work to, right? I say very famously now, I am been over mentored and under sponsored in my career. And I talk a lot about that in the book, but finding people who will invest in your career and help you advance and get to go where you are. So I think that when you do tie all your fortunes to the toxic leader, the toxic boss, manager, that's when it's like, oh, what do I do now? Then perhaps it's like, all right, let me assess. I might have to move on here.
I smiled when you said that because I had the exact opposite happen in my career. Very early on, my first really great job was working for the Financial Times when I was 27.
Mm.
And I and the other 25 people who were hired by the then U.S. editor, a guy named Robert Thompson, who's now quite senior at News Corp, we tied our fortunes to him. And we, we jokingly called him Papa, and he took care of us. And he was very puckish. He was this Australian guy who wanted to really stick it to all the Brits in the UK. And I thought, man, I'm sailing along. And then, of course, then he left. And then the new guy came in. I'm like, huh, that wasn't such a good idea, now was it? And then, of course, the new guy had all the people. That happens. But, you know the company does. We focus on caregiving. We focus on allyship at work. Myth 8 in your book talks about companies focusing on maternity leave as a cure-all or parental leave in general. If I remember correctly, you have 2 kids. I have 3 kids. I always say that parental leave is essential. It's a starting point, but it neglects the reality of being a working parent, whether you're a mom or a dad. What can companies do to recognize that things don't get easier after 4 or 6 months? If anything, some of us would reflect back and say, man,
those were the easy years.
I wish my teenager was 6 months old again.
Right. I wish they didn't talk back to me. I wish they couldn't move.
Yeah, just smile at me.
Just smiled. Smile. Yes, I'll change diapers. Yeah. In this myth, Paul, I talk about, of course, we support women. We just extended maternity leave.
Yeah.
And one of the things I keep coming back to, and I know you talk about this a lot as a thought leader and someone who's running this amazing company, is that the world of work for women can't change without men. And so when we talk about building an inclusive culture for women, first of all, not all women want to become mothers. So there's that piece, right? Yeah. Maternity leave, it's really parental leave. And even when you offer, as many companies do, and I know you talk about this a lot, you offer leave equally. No matter how I've become a parent, we all get the equal amount of leave. It's about the role modeling.
Yeah.
And so when I worked with Men Plus Care years ago, we did a study where we saw parental leaves for men, the utilization rates were so low because there was, as you talk about, the stereotypes, the bias, is he golfing? Is he really helping with the family?
Right.
What does he need leave for? The wife should be, all the things.
When he comes back, how was your vacation? Like,
exactly, which sounds like very 2000, but it's still happening. Those comments are still being made behind closed doors and often in public. And so that's really like the role modeling starts with, this is important. My partner has a doctor's appointment. I'm going to it, right? I'm going to go to all the doctor's appointments. I'm taking the lead. Let me talk about what's going to happen when I'm out with my team or how I'm going to be backfilled. Let me be communicative and be excited and share pictures of my child and let them know how I'm doing caregiving as a father. And then when I'm coming back, how am I going to, as you said, that's just the beginning. So how am I ramping back to work? How am I continuing to not silently walk out the door? No, I'm picking up my child from daycare. No, I'm leaving for the preschool meeting. No, like I am role modeling actively so that it is now acceptable for anybody to be a caregiver at work. And that it's something that we're all proud of rather than hiding it.
Yeah, we've talked about a couple of things that the company does, care days, which are, emergency days off if there's a care emergency, and care shifts, which allow people to work sort of a concentrated period of time, like 10 to 3 or something like that, and then fill it in the rest of the time. And we broaden it out to using the word care because not, as you said, not everyone's a mom, not everybody's a dad, but pretty much everyone is a caregiver at some point, a spouse, a partner, a sick pet, a parent. And I understand, how effective the role modeling is from the emerging leader and all the people below him or her because they look up to that emerging leader.
Of course.
But how does it rise up to the level above? How does that person's role modeling of the caregiving that he or she is doing, loudly, which is important, loudly, as he or she leaves work? How does that, effectively, rise up to the leadership that, may suffer from some confirmation bias? Like, look, I'm in my 60s. I got here doing this. Why aren't you doing this? Or, hey, I only took a day off when my kids were born and I never changed a diaper. I mean, those are extreme, silly examples. They're real, but they're on the extreme. How does it rise up instead of, I understand how people can look up.
Absolutely. Yeah. That's a great question. It rises up because we've got Generation Z, right? We have a generation that's come into the workforce that it's like, I want companies that match my values. These are things that are important to me. It's really difficult when you're the first and the lonely only, no matter what you're doing, right? And if you're the only, let's say, associate brand manager father, back in my days of marketing, you're the only one who's doing this and role modeling, you're afraid of retaliation. You're afraid of career consequences. But what if there was more of us? What if there's more people doing that?
Yeah.
And if I
manage, and there are, they're just silent. They need somebody.
Yeah. But it's like, if we're all doing it, and then you as a leader, who's the general manager of this division, you're like, wow, I've got a lot of men who are taking the full parental leave. And I have a lot of men very proudly talking about their families and how they're caregiving. That's where it starts to change. And, you know, change, as I always say on my podcast, Roundtable Talk with DC Marshall, it starts with tough conversations. We can't change what we won't discuss. Like, if you're the one who's like hiding out, you know, like Sheryl Sandberg has that famous story of where she would park all the way in the back or try to sneak out because she was afraid of how she might be judged because she was leaving early to get her children. Many people really relate to that. And it's like, well, no, what if we all were like, yeah, it's 4:45, I have to leave, I gotta go with my kids.
Right.
It becomes normalized. We're not hiding it anymore.
You know, myth number 9 is really in the company dad's wheelhouse. And that chapter, if I wrote it down correctly, is entitled, "These DEI efforts don't benefit me. My voice as a white man doesn't count anymore." And this chapter was fascinating for me to read. Because, as you said, it's one of the things we really try to do with the company dads is to be allies and to show that, you know, when men step up, it's good for them, but it also helps, you know, women at work as well. How can privilege, just walk us through, the listeners through this, about how can privilege become an asset for change and not an anchor to preserve the status quo?
That's a powerful question. I think that's the work we're all fighting to do. I think, one, to acknowledge that we all have privilege. You know, oftentimes we get very caught up in, is it this, is it that? I mean, we all have privilege, whether that's race or gender or where you grew up or where you went to school. I have privilege. And so I think if we can just acknowledge that, because words like privilege become a lightning rod. Like, people certainly are like, oh, yeah. Right. Yeah. And it's like, okay, well, no, what does that mean? That just means I've had a different life journey than you. And if we were to compare our life journeys, there are some moments where you had more privilege than me. And I'm sure there are some moments where I've been more privileged than you. And so that's like, oh, okay, that's what that's about. Okay, so you might have more power in situations than I do. And so if you are at work with me, you likely could use that power for good to help create a more inclusive environment. And so what do those simple things look like? If you are leading a team, you don't wait for HR. Let me say this again. Do not wait for HR to check if your team is being paid fairly and equitably. It is your job to check if your team is being paid fairly and equitably. Now, go and look at the numbers and then go ask HR and legal for help. But when we think about pay inequity disparity, like, that is an easy way and a quick way to show up as an ally, right? Okay, actually, the men and women on my team, wow, I didn't even realize this. There's discrepancies. I need help. Yeah. Next time you get asked to join a panel, Paul, and I know you would do this, I'm joining a panel of all white men. Well, let me ask the organizer, what are you going to do to drive diversity of representation? And Paul gets a lot of speaking opportunities. So he's going to say, if you don't add more women, white women and women of color, to this conversation, I'm respectfully going to back out. Right.
That was my old life when I wrote books and was at the New York Times. Now it's actually the opposite. I'm the only guy on a panel of all women.
That could be true. Yes. But then you should also, so that's really interesting too. Like, especially for this conversation, we need more voices of men at the table, right? So people get really uncomfortable about this, but like, in a perfect utopia, you want every voice at the table, and you want, we're looking at the lens of gender, you want there to be gender balance. You want both men and women. And so that's also wonderful for you to say, hey, we're talking about caregiving. We have like 9 women on this panel and 1 man. Not that there'd be 9 women and 1 man, but you, like, if there was a situation like that, some sort of roundtable conversation, be like, you know, I have 3 other men I'd like to invite to this. How would you feel about that? And likely they would say, wow, that's great. I hadn't thought about that, Paul. Thank you so much. And so they would probably welcome those additions.
I had a conversation yesterday, the private equity backed company that the company dads is hopefully going to do some work for them. and it was 3 women on the call and 1 man. And the man is the one who brought me into the conversation, and he said, I was kind of giving the whole spiel of how when you add, more diverse voices, like for caregiving, when you add not just a man, but when you add, caregivers who may be, gay or lesbian or bisexual or caregiver, it deepens and enriches the conversation. And the 3 women 100% got it. But then this guy spoke up and said, just so you know, a year ago we had a workshop here, and I attended because I'm the lead dad. He's an attorney, I'm a lead dad in my relationship. And I got really uncomfortable, and I ate my lunch and I left. And it was this moment for everybody else, like, okay, if we're going to move this thing forward, let's get everybody involved. Let's, as I say, like if we could, have 1 fewer bad joke a week about caregiving in the workplace,
Yes.
we're making some progress. You talked about, Gen Z pushing things along. Millennials are thinking, differently too. But, if you could think of ways to get men who may be hesitant to step up, to give them sort of license to step up, what's needed to get, more men in senior or almost senior roles to step up?
In my role as a chief diversity officer, I'm always trying to reach people where they are and help them along in their journey. And there's kindness and compassion in that. And I talk about this in Reimagine Inclusion, is that we lack that in our workplaces. So if, let's say, a white man I'm working with who's a senior executive has a question, and I say, I can't believe you would ask that question. Like, come on, you're really asking that question? Like, right. Oh, or if I go even more extreme, that was a really racist, sexist, or homophobic comment, right? And so that breaks down psychological safety, and that person's likely never going to come back to me again, rather than helping to educate and teach them. And so that's where I think we need more of that. Now, I'm not saying that you can continue to cause hurt and harm. That's not what I'm saying.
Right.
But I'm saying, like, the first time someone makes a mistake, I talk a lot about intent and impact. I do think most people have positive intent. The impact doesn't always land the way we want it to. And so I think if we had more kindness and compassion and forgiveness in our workplace, but at the same time, for the men who are leading, wow, what an amazing responsibility and legacy you have to think about how you can change the makeup of your team and how you could leave this company in a different place than you found it. And so I think oftentimes it takes one-on-one conversations, but it also takes, as you know, men helping other men along. Sometimes it takes men to reach other men. And so oftentimes I think about that in my work too, that if Paul is someone I'm working closely with who really is excited about the efforts at our company, I might say, hey, Paul, what about your colleague on your team? Do you want to talk to him and see if he wants to come to the workshop next week or meet with HR about that policy we're working on for caregiving? And so it's really like, it's the tipping point, right? Like, I always say, like, find 1 or 2 other people. I'm not telling you to find 20, right? It's like the influence. Find 1 or 2 other people that you know that you can get to care about this, because you know they have a daughter, they have a son, they have a niece, they have somebody who they care about, and they want the world of work to be different for that person.
Yeah, we've seen it because, like, as I said, dads in their 20s and 30s are having fundamentally different conversations. Dads in their 40s and 50s, where I fall, I've been a lead dad for a long time, but where a lot of them had this moment during COVID where they sort of rethought what they wanted to do and how they wanted to do it. And then in some cases, the dads in their 60s and 70s, when I sort of tell them what we're doing, they're kind of hopeless, unless they have a child, a son or a daughter, but it's often a daughter. They have a child who they're very proud of. They're seeing that child do really well. And then, like, well, wait a second, I got here doing this in a very traditional way. It doesn't have to be that way, but you need that exposure.
I love that. Yes.
Yeah. One thing I was intrigued by in the book, a phrase I'd never heard of before, a story I'd never heard of before, but I loved it, was the curb cut effect. For the listeners, could you just, I don't want to steal your thunder, describe what the curb cut effect is, and then talk about how it can be applied to the workplace?
Yeah, the excuse me, let me start again. I can edit this part. The curb cut effect was something I had studied that many listeners have probably heard of, is back to the city of San Francisco and how they were trying to make the sidewalks and roads more accessible, particularly for individuals with wheelchairs. We're utilizing wheelchairs. And so you think about, if you have a memory or can pull up a memory of a sidewalk and a street you likely will see an indentation, right? When the sidewalk's meeting the street, a way to get off safely. And so very interesting, and a great analogy for what we're talking about for the workplace is that when they did that, they realized it wasn't just for the one group of individuals they had in mind, right? They created the curb cut effect for, let's say, individuals who were utilizing wheelchairs. All of a sudden, people with strollers, bicycles, and skateboarders, someone who's maybe using a cane, maybe you're pushing a little trolley. So you're like, wow, like this one thing that we thought was going to help this group of individuals helped so many more. And so you think about, when it comes to our workplace policies, you think about the battle of 5 days in the office, or fully remote, and you're like, yeah, this doesn't just impact this one group of people. It actually, when you think about it, I think any person I talk to wants flexibility in their life when it comes to work. And so you think about these policies and you're like, okay, you might have it in mind for that one person, which is great. It's likely going to have a ripple effect on other people as well.
Yeah, you know, flexibility to me is almost like when you talked about privilege being a charged word. I frame it in the sense of like responsibility. If you give people responsibility, they're going to do the job that they need to do. And for good or bad, you know, very few of us who have jobs like this, white collar, you know, shut off at 5 o'clock. And so there's time to like, oh, well, I put my kids to bed, or I just watch a show. Why don't I answer 10 emails now? And so when you give people agency and responsibility, I think they're more apt to you know, to appreciate it and to work in a different way. Myth 13 is, we can work from home now. The future of work is inclusive. And this was, you know, intriguing to me because, like many ideas, you know, the company dads came out of COVID when suddenly, you know, we're all working from home. And I was pretty confident that we would work differently when we went back. And I was also pretty confident from, you know, my previous life that companies would make a lot of mistakes, that even well-intentioned companies would do, you know, the wrong thing. And we had this period, and we had a CEO on a couple weeks ago, who was the CEO of Virgin Pulse, who was pretty sure that he was going to be a traditional CEO and have everybody come back to the office. And then the second wave of COVID hit, and he said, well, forget this. This isn't going to work. And his company is thriving. It's a healthcare tech company. It's thriving because he's allowed remote work with intentional times, of course, to get together. But after almost those halcyon days of remote work, there seems, you know, we're talking now, you know, shortly before your book comes out, it's come out in October. I don't know, backlash is an overused word, but there seems to be more of a pull to get people back in the office. And I've been very, you know, publicly and stridently critical of leaders like, you know, Jamie Dimon at JP Morgan and David Solomon at Goldman Sachs, who have instituted these policies that feel more 1983 than 2023. And you lay out in this chapter all the right ways to have, you know, to make the future of work inclusive, to go remote first with some of your policies. But there is this strong pull in certain sectors. What are your thoughts on that, and on the sectors where they really are trying to pull the people back into a pre-pandemic way of working?
I think they'll eventually lose their talent over time, because again, when there's plenty of jobs in the market, and that'll happen again, and some would argue there are still pockets, people who have highly skilled expertise that are really sought after in demand, I will go to the employer of choice who allows me to work, as you said, love it, responsibly. I'm an adult.
Right.
You hired me to do
you
a
did
job.
hire, you hired me for some sort of
You hired me to do a job.
Yeah.
I know how to do it.
Yeah.
And so it's this push-pull. And I don't know is it because of people feel micromanagement tendencies and a loss of control? Is it because I was raised in a corporate America where I was supposed to sit in a corner office and be able to look out my glass office and see everybody that worked for me and just run out, and they would run up and do whatever I want? You know, like, I don't know. Or is it the real estate, you know, theory, conspiracy theory? What's going to happen to all the real estate in the country and around the world if people don't go back? Whatever. I don't know what it is, but I know that it's not the future. And I know that this will be here forever, this tension between people demanding people to be back 5 days and other people saying remote. Listen, we all want connection.
Yeah.
right? So no one's arguing that. And I think in the example of the individual you had as a guest is yes, we work remotely, but we get together as needed in person. And I also think we underestimate the intimacy over Zoom. It's actually much more intimate, even as we're talking. We're probably sitting closer, we're being more intentional,
Yeah.
right? And so I think I've built so many great relationships virtually. And so I don't think we should underestimate the power of that.
It is a connection because I mean, just remember we all used to have fake backgrounds. We don't do that anymore,
Yes.
and so you get a sense of like, oh, what other depth does that person have? What other things that might that
Yeah.
person, like, you talk about building these policies, remote first, and I can hear the pushback. Well, that may work for she works for a tech company. Well, of course they can do that because they're a tech company and it's easy. How do you get older companies to rethink the way they're doing things so that they don't think like, no, you have to be here, I have to see you, I have to talk to you, I have to be able to yell at you, I have to be able to do this, whereas the remote first is the future. And maybe the question is, how do you train managers to be better at remote first than falling back on the old way of doing things?
I struggle with the word tech. Aren't we all tech companies now? Aren't we living in a world where I can order a Chipotle burrito right now while we talk? Like everything is whatever you're looking at, it's tech first. And so I'm sort of like, interest. I still think about that. Like any company should really be leading with technology. And as the demographics of the US continue to change right now, the US government says about 40% of individuals identify as non-white. That will get to 50% in 10 years. It'll continue to rise. You think about the individuals from historically marginalized communities that you want to attract, develop, retain, promote. And you have to start thinking about, I talk about it in Reimagine Inclusion, the flexibility, the responsibility, and the ease of people feel like they can work from home and just be more productive and have those days to do that. And so I think that is where you're just going to be better off for your employees, better off than your competition. You're going to be better off and ahead if you can build a company that really thinks remote first and tech first versus adding it to the side. And I think that's where many companies still, Paul, aren't getting it right. And they're demanding people back into the office because we all fell into the pandemic. No one really thought strategically about how do we actually work together now in a hybrid world.
Yeah, I tell this story that my middle daughter's best friend, her parents are both oncologists and they both work at Memorial Sloan Kettering. And this girl's father is actually trying to cure cancer. Like he's a very specific type of cancer, wildly brilliant guy. And he learned during the pandemic that he could run his labs remotely. They could do a lot of the tests they were doing. He still obviously has to see patients. And I always tell this story because I'm like, you know what? I don't think any of the rest of us are trying to cure cancer. And the guy who is trying to cure cancer is able to work remotely. And he fell into it. And MSK is obviously the type of, research-based hospital that values outcomes, more than anything else. But when you think about what do you think ultimately, you answered it a different way before, but what do you think ultimately will win over those managers who are reluctant to lead remote first? Is it their top talent?
I think when they'll start
or,
losing offers and losing people, right? So if you give me an offer and we have like an amazing, I say courtship, meet all these people, fantastic offer. And you're like, oh, by the way, this is 5 days a week in the office. Oh, didn't realize that. Game over. Sorry, I have another offer, Paul. Right. When more of that starts to happen, you will see.
Don't say Paul. I'd let you work remotely. Don't say Paul. I'm kidding.
Paul. I'll say some other name. But but then I will go to Paul. We'll say you were Mike. I'll go to Paul because Paul will let me work remote with travel. Great. I'm taking the offer. Yeah. That's what it's going to come down to. And you'll see that start to shift. People want to have flexibility and responsibility, I will say both. They want that in their lives, right? Especially after the 3 years of grief we've all been through. People have reevaluated what's important to them.
This has been great. Mita Mallick, author of Reimagine Inclusion, Debunking 13 Myths to Transform Your Workplace. One final question here. I'm going to put you on the spot with this one. You've been wildly successful. You're smart, you're charismatic, you're a moving speaker, you're a real thinker. You've got 2 children. Is your husband a lead dad? like me.
I couldn't do it without him. Takes partnership.
That's what I want to hear. That's great. Mita Mallick, thank you again for being my guest today.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening to the Company of Dads podcast. I also want to thank the people who make this podcast and everything else that we do at the Company of Dads possible. Helder Mira, who is our audio producer. Lindsay Decker, who handles all of our social media. Terry Brennan, who's helping us with the newsletter and audience acquisition. Emily Servin, who is our web maestro. And of course, Evan Roosevelt, who is working side by side with me in many of the things that we do here at the Company of Dads. It's a great team, and we're just trying to bring you the best in fatherhood. Remember, the one-stop shop for everything is our newsletter, The Dad. Sign up at thecompanyofdads.com/thedad. Thank you again for listening.